Hello, everyone. I'm Rocco Rossi, the President and CEO of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, and this is part of our continuing series of webinars on helping you to navigate through the COVID-19 crisis and out the other side. Today also, though, happens to be the National Day of Mourning. It's a time when we recognize all of those who've died or been injured at work. This is something that has touched many. I lost an uncle who was only 22 on a construction site only months after he had come to Canada to build his dream of a better life, and it was taken away at a far too early age. My heart goes out to all of those who've been similarly affected, and we redouble our efforts and make a commitment to ensure that we make our workplaces as safe as possible. And that is really a nice dovetail into today, because as we think about reopening the economy, data is going to be a very powerful tool in all of that. But as we think of using that tool, how do we ensure that privacy and the integrity of data are protected along the way? Because we're committed to doing a safe reopening, but we also want one that's respectful of all and is built on the real facts. And we've brought together a fantastic panel today, which I will shortly turn over to my colleague to introduce. But first, I want to thank our ongoing sponsors of the series, Canada Life and the Chamber's Plan. I want to thank my staff for doing all of the amazing things to pull this together. And I want to thank all of our Chamber members for the work you're doing each and every day, leaning into this crisis, giving us the stories and input we need to bring your voice to the decision makers in the halls of power. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Brent Edwards, to introduce the panel and get us started.
Thank you so much, Rocco. Delighted to be part of another webinar for the OCC. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Rocco pointed out, with the roadmaps that the provinces are rolling out, looking at how we reopen the economy, there's a lot of questions that have come up around systems and processes, and what this means for the workforce of the future. We pulled together today what we think is a really terrific panel providing different perspectives on what this means in terms of information, data, and privacy. We're joined today to provide both a legal perspective, a business and workforce training perspective, and a perspective from the post-secondary education world. Our three speakers are Christine Ng, who's partner at McCarthy Tétrault, Emad Rizkallah, who's the founder and CEO of Blue Drop Performance Learning, and Isaac Straley, who's the Chief Information Security Officer at the University of Toronto. A few housekeeping items. We will be taking questions from yourselves, looking for interactive discussion. We would ask that you go and look at your chat box, and please insert any questions that you have for our panel. Panel will be speaking for approximately half an hour, and then we will be going to questions with the panelists, and we'll do our best to address some of the questions that are brought up by yourselves in the audience. So let's get started. Just a little more detail on our first speaker, Christine Ng. She's the co-leader of the Technology Law Group and the FinTech Group at McCarthy Tétrault, who is a corporate member of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. She has over 20 years of experience in strategic commercial transactions and collaborative arrangements having technology, intellectual property, and data at their core. She's extensive experience in the areas of information technology law, including outsourcing. And it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Christine Ng.
Thanks very much, Brent and Rocco. I'm very excited to be here. It's actually my first home webinar. I really struggled with this presentation, not so much on the presentation itself, but on deciding whether I would actually get out of my favorite work track pants that I've been enjoying for the past 6 weeks. And the answer is I actually did. So I am delighted to be here, and it is so interesting that we are now talking about reopening Canada. Um, Without a vaccine, that is a bit of a tricky strategy. So we actually really need to focus now on really avoiding resurgence, so that we can open the country and province safely. So we've been hearing a lot about the importance of contact tracing in that battle to avoid that resurgence. So I thought today I might talk a little bit about contact tracing. You're hearing about it a lot in the news, and it does raise a number of sort of interesting privacy issues that I thought we could chat about briefly. Particularly, as all of us being Canadians and interested in maintaining our privacy rights, but also doing what we can to really help the country more generally in getting back to business and ensuring the health and safety of all of its citizens. So what exactly is contact tracing? It's basically just tracking down anyone who might have been infected by a person that was recently diagnosed. It was actually used in the fight against SARS, and was really considered one of the key reasons that that epidemic didn't get completely out of control. So once contacted, the individuals can basically quarantine themselves and prevent the spread. How's that being done currently? It's really a very manual process, and some of you may have seen the pleas from the province asking for people, trying to really recruit people to be contact tracer volunteers. There's a shortage of individuals, and so they need to really augment the workforce and train more people to do this. So right now, in most countries, including in Ontario, the public health workers work with basically a positive patient, and manually go through this process of trying to help them recall people with whom they had some contact with during their infectious period. And one of the difficulties with this, of course, is that it only helps if you know the people that you've been dealing with and their identities. If you have been in contact with, sort of strangers, it's quite possible that you will not be able to identify them, and that will, of course, make our battle in fighting that resurgence even harder. So basically, the contacts that are identified by the infected person are then contacted by the public health person, and they're given information and basically instructed to quarantine and monitor themselves for illness. It's an incredibly manual process, and you would sort of think that this would be a great use case for technology, and indeed it is. There's been lots in the news lately about different types of contact tracing technologies. And I'm just going to speak about one that was actually launched in Australia. They call theirs COVID Safe. It was launched in Australia on Sunday. It's actually based on this Singapore's Trace Together software, which Singapore has used. In Australia, it was launched on Sunday, and by Tuesday at noon their time, 2.5 million Australians had downloaded it. It was completely, it's not mandatory, but really people were called upon to exercise their civic duty to download it and use it, because in order for these apps to be effective, they have to be downloaded by a good substantial portion of the society. And in Australia, that number was sort of close to about half the population. So how does this thing work? Essentially, it works through your mobile phone. It uses your Bluetooth signals to track when people are close to another app user. So both people have to have downloaded the app, which is why it's important that there's significant uptake of the app. It really only tracks your sort of your proximity and the duration of your exposure to those around you. There's no tracking of your location through GPS location. So that's one of the sort of privacy respecting measures that the app has. The data is stored on the individual's phone for a certain period of time. I think it's 21 days. And then if it's actually not uploaded anywhere, it just stays on your phone. But if you are actually diagnosed and as positive, then at that point you would upload upload all the contact information that's being collected on your phone about who you've been close to for a certain duration of time. When it gets uploaded to a central server, and in Australia that server is actually located in Australia on AWS cloud, but that the server is only accessible to health officials. So essentially, it's not until you are tested positive that the data that's captured on your phone about who you've been in contact with gets uploaded to the central server. And at that point, it's now accessible to the health officials, who generate a list of contacts and then can begin contacting the individuals and advising them to self-isolate. The other privacy respecting measures built into this app is that really you're not told if you're contacted, you're not told who actually you were close to that tested positive. So the identity of the infected person, it remains private. You're just told that basically you've been informed. You're basically just told that you've been exposed to someone and what you need to do about that. So again, very manual process that we have currently, and there's a potential for the technology to really assist us in getting ahead of the spread. So there are a number of privacy issues that have arisen in all countries that are looking at contact tracing, and I'll just stick to the example in Australia. There was obviously some concern about the preserving the privacy of Australians, and the health minister there actually issued what they call a determination, so something slightly less than full legislation, that would prevent the data that is collected and uploaded from being used for any other purpose, including law enforcement and court orders. They've encrypted all the data, so it's on your phone. It's supposed to be quite secure. The data again is on your phone, or it's on the central server, which is located in Australia, which is subject to all kinds of security controls. But even with all of those controls, I think Australia has indicated that they may be introducing legislation to basically turn that determination of the health minister that the data can only be used for these very limited purposes into law. So there are also other ways, privacy rights can be respected. Transparency is a big thing to generate trust and privacy. And so the app is, the source code for the app is currently being considered for release under an open source license, so people can examine that. So what's happening in Canada? It's actually interesting right now. BC is in the early stages of examining the Singaporean app, so this is the Trace Together app, so the same app that the Australian app is based on. The BC Information and Privacy Commissioner there has, in the last couple of days, spoken with his counterpart in Singapore about some of the privacy concerns, and of course, certainly concerned about making sure that we've really struck the right balance between the privacy rights of Canadians and really the public health interest in using this. Around the world, there's a bit of like a beta VHS battle, and many of you will have heard that both Google and Apple are working on a contact tracing model. It's the sort of the beta VHS aspect is that the Trace Together app is really really a centralized approach, in that all the data of the individuals who are tested positive are uploaded to this central government server, and then individuals are then notified that they've been in close contact with someone who's been infected. Whereas under the Google Apple model is really more of a decentralized model, where really the data is being shared in a peer-to-peer way. So basically it goes from one individual's mobile phone to another's without going up to this central server. From a privacy perspective, Google and Apple are saying that they have really the more privacy enhanced model, because there is no central sort of honeypot where the data could be attacked, and there's also all the data is distributed and not held by the government, so that the government has limited, there's no it lowers the risk that the government could use that data for other purposes. So just done a sort of quick count today on which countries around the world are going centralized and which are going decentralized. Centralized nations looks like it's UK, Australia, France is sort of still sitting on the fence. They seem to be going centralized, but there are petitions there. Germany just switched over. I think they're going decentralized, with Switzerland, Estonia, and Austria also being decentralized. So currently a lot of decisions being made, and certainly provinces within Canada will still have to make the decisions themselves. And really assessing the different apps and different ways things can be done in Canada. There are a lot of privacy considerations to make sure that our privacy rights are being protected. And in that regard, about 10 days ago, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada released a framework to assist government institutions who are really tasked with looking at a number of these new technologies, including contact tracing technologies, and assessing them from a privacy risk perspective. So that framework sets out a number of principles, but I think that the ones that are most interesting are the ones that really relate to the specific identified purpose. So this is where the purpose of the use must be very specific and must be complied with. It's really for protecting public health, no other purpose. And the exceptional measures that are being being used now, everything should be time limited, and data collected during this period should be destroyed when the crisis ends. That all in accordance with sort of the general privacy principle that there really should be data minimization, so no unnecessary holding of our data. So as the governments consider which technologies, they've got to consider this guidance from the commissioner. But then there's a whole other there are myriad of other privacy laws across Canada, provincial health privacy laws, municipal privacy laws, we got the federal privacy laws. So those that are actually involved in this, including the government, any suppliers who are providing products, will have to make sure that they are compliant with all of these laws. The guidance from the commissioner is very clear that there's not a let on privacy obligations in Canada just because we're in this situation. But we will be interested to see where this is headed, how quickly we can get solutions that are workable, and to see what the reaction from Canadians will be from a privacy perspective. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Christine, for sharing those learnings from Singapore and the example from Australia. There's a lot of considerations that we need to think about as the economy opens up, and thank you for taking us through those examples. So the next speaker is Imad Rizkallah. So Imad is the founder and CEO of Blue Drop Performance Consulting out of St. John's, Newfoundland, Labrador. He's a CEO And Blue Drop employs almost 200 people and is a global innovator in workforce upskilling. The company is transforming the way governments, industries, and companies deliver, track, validate, and manage lifelong skills and qualifications. And we're delighted that Emad was able to join us today.
Can you see me? And let me make sure that I'm visible there. Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here, and I do have a presentation. Brent, do you have that by any chance? Because of course,
Yes,
I'm having some technical challenges here.
Roland has
work.
it and can keep up for you.
Hi, Matt. This is Roland from OCC, and your COVID-19 Technology is the New Normal presentation is up on screen. You are good to go.
Oh, perfect. Okay, great. Thank you. So let me just get rid of some of this here. The only problem is I can't see what, there it is. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. All right, so yeah, happy to take you through it. Obviously, we are involved in this space, and privacy and security has been a big part of what we've been doing for the last 10 years. That's our empty building in St. John's, Newfoundland, like many other empty buildings around the world right now. I miss it. Next, please. So I shouldn't be using PowerPoint because I always try to stop. I love this quote, and I'm addicted to PowerPoint, I confess. People who use PowerPoint never have any power and they seldom have a point. And here I am with PowerPoint, so that'll make anybody who else is addicted to it feel better. We work in different countries around the world, so obviously the context of privacy and security and the way it's very different in other countries, of course. I think, in my opinion, I think Canada has it just about right. We'll share with you some of our experiences navigating those waters shortly. You know, but we are a company because we have a military division that has NATO secrets, so we take this very seriously, and it is sort of breathtaking in some senses to see how little people pay attention to it in some countries, and obviously in other countries even more than Canada. Next, please. So just some context before we get into this, you know, in terms of the social context and the economic context before you get into topics like today's, we have to understand that the workforce, of course, is going through the biggest change. This is the fourth industrial revolution. It's probably the biggest change in the history of work in human history. So this is before COVID-19. 50% of people in the next couple of years will be participating in the gig economy. The average worker, of course, has many jobs in their career. RBC came out with a study 2 years ago that basically said 25% of jobs will be heavily disrupted in this decade. 50% will require completely new skills. So that was the context before COVID-19. Next. So next, please. So now we're talking about COVID-19, and of course, you know, this is people used to fly, and do you remember when we used to do that next? And then, of course, kids were in school. You can give someone on the beach that you don't know a hug. You know, you can shake hands with people. For those of you into bowling, you can bowl. And that was life before. And the hard thing to remember, next, please. And the hard thing to remember is that, next, is that, you know, that was only 6 weeks ago that we could do all these things. So life has certainly moved very quickly. And so now, looking at those changes that are going on in the workforce, what's new? Next. Next, please. Oh, sorry, we went too far ahead. Too far ahead, please. So I think post-COVID-19, this is a little bit excessive to say all bets are off, but certainly, and we are working with epidemiologists and public health officials on the COVID Passport project, but certainly automation is going to accelerate now. A lot of jobs that are being lost today, unfortunately, aren't coming back. We're already on a trend where 80% of job losses were tied to automation. I think that's going to increase. And I think that health security and jobs are going to trump almost everything else in privacy, much the same way that security trumped almost everything else after 9/11, and you know the pendulum swung way too far in one direction. We don't seem to have kind of the pendulum ever staying in the center. It always goes to one extreme or another. My opinion from the experts I talk to, even in the public health world, is that we're going to be there. So, and we are working with Dr. David Mowat on a project, who used to be the Deputy Chief Chief of Health for Canada. And he said, basically, in the battle between public health and lawyers, public health wins. And I said, really? And what do you mean by that? He said, well, that's just historical. He's not saying that they should win, they shouldn't, but in his experience, they win. And we actually found this on a website. We were just doing some research, and it says here, if the government, you can see like who has access to your health records, most sensitive stuff out there. And they even have that, if the government passes a law allowing records to be released, you might, in the case of communicable diseases especially, you can have releasing of health records to safeguard the health of the general population. So there is a mindset already that when it's a public health emergency, even health records, and of course, you know, in Ontario now, paramedics can search your COVID results before they show up. So these kinds of things will happen in real time in response to a pandemic. Next, please. So our worker passport technology, when we speak about, you know, just our experiences in this area and why I was invited to the panel, I think, is because we do have a worker passport technology. It's really a source of truth where credentials and certificates can be tracked. And this is now being discussed for COVID-19 status. If people, a lot of talk about immunity passports, the science isn't there yet, but there are other things that you can do with immunity passports, or COVID-19 passports, as we call them, that have nothing to do with the antibody testing and whether you're immune or not. So this is going to be an issue that's going to be coming up and debated very hotly. And I think decisions will be made very quickly. And of course, our platform allows people to get that certificate. Right now, it's used for health and safety. For example, working at Heights in Ontario, you show it, you scan it, you bring it to your employer, a regulator or an inspector can look at it. Next, please. And so this technology is now already in use in 5 provinces with over 2 million workers on it in Canada. So that's one of the reasons we've been brought into this conversation, because you know, they're looking for innovative solutions that can help where we already have that footprint. The question is, can this be used more broadly? And having done 5 provinces, we've gone through 5 sets of privacy impact assessments, 5 sets of, you know, threat risk assessments, 5 sets of vulnerability testing. There is no consistency. I'm unhappy to tell you, across the country, everybody has different standards and different, but you have to kind of measure up to those. I'm not complaining. I think that's very helpful, and Canada is in a good place in that regard. Next, please. So the latest challenge, of course, is the passport, and we see it as really 2 streams to kind of secure the workplace. The first one is just basic training, that people should have to do an online course that's approved, that's standardized. We've been doing the research again with Dr. Mowat. We've just done a survey. I have some preliminary results. 28% of people that are working out there today in our survey, which is about 200 people, so it's not scientific yet. We have to do more work, but just early results. 28% of the workers out there got no training whatsoever. 40% got basically their manager telling them something, or in a couple of minutes, or within 5 to 15 minutes was 40%. About 30% of them have never heard about it after the initial training. This is surely not the way that we're going to safeguard our economy. And that's one of the absolute easy wins. It's so important that we just started building it. We'll give it away, by the way. We're building these courses. If there's a way to deliver it, if people have a way to do that, we're happy to share. But we just started building it because, you know, you can kind of sort of guess when you're dealing with millions of small businesses. They're not epidemiologists. The amount of information out there about what to do to keep safe is overwhelming. You have very important people telling you to drink Javex these days, as you know. You know, so the amount of knowledge, and it's overwhelming, and they're not professional trainers. They don't have a sort of a process in which to safeguard. So I would say there's one message I would leave with you, is that content should be standardized, should be available to every business. Workers can do it. Workers can be tested. And if they're using our technology, they can get the QR code and actually show it as they go from job to job. And I think that's important. But either way, I'm just happy to offer that because we think it's important. The second part is sort of the more controversial part, which is a health record, essentially. And we don't actually want the health record. We want just to be able to issue certificates because we don't want that data. So we're calling it a defense certificate. And the easiest way to do it is a PCR test, which is the nasal swabs. California just announced they're going to be prioritizing high-risk jobs to get regular testing, whether you have symptoms or not, because that's very important. And you can maybe every couple of weeks have a nasal swab, and so you say you're working in home care, you'd be able to prove that you're not infected. And that actually happens, believe it or not, in all kinds of industry. The weirdest one, which I'll put forward, is in the adult film industry. You have to, I mean, HIV is a contagious disease, of course. They certainly don't follow social distancing in that industry. You know, the precautions are not there, of course. So what you have to do there is every 2 weeks, people have to get a certificate that they're HIV free. And that means that their risk of, I mean, of course, they could be infected before working, but that means that the risk is greatly reduced. So we have to think of risk not as digital. Everybody's waiting for the measles vaccine. That's what a lot of the sort of the media is about. Like, the science isn't there. The science will eventually be there. It might say that if you have antibodies, you're 80% safe, but 80% is better than not having any data. And that's why the nasal swabs, if you have a period of time where you get a certificate that expires in a week or 2 weeks or a month, that's still better than nothing. So that area is what we're working on, and that's going to be, I think, a big area in the workplace as well. Next, please. So what about human rights? Because, you know, is it right to work a human right? So in you know, this is a valid question where, you know, there's a lot of policy discussions and ethical discussions and regulatory and legal framework discussions, liability discussions that have to happen. Obviously, that's not us. We're just trying to prepare the technology so it's ready when the government says go, and this is how we want to use it. So we're working around the clock now on that issue. China has a very intense version of this where basically through the contact tracing, if you have been close to someone, say 3 seats back or 1 seat back on a train or a plane, they have a green certificate, and they'll wake up one day and it's red, and they're forced to go into isolation and they can't work and they can't travel. That seems like a very much a dystopian kind of future, but that's in use today. That's sort of the extreme version. So we can, next please. So obviously human rights, in Canada, we're much more gentle, and obviously we look at it and say, what if that person, you know, how unfair that would be, the Chinese example, but what if that person was a home care worker, next please, who was taking care of your mother or your grandmother? I think people might have a different opinion as to whether or not the rights that are infringed upon are okay to do that in that case when that person who might be infectious or not as safe is taking care of a loved one. So that's the debate that's going to have to happen in society. I think the technology is the simple part. We can turn it on to be one extreme or another extreme. I think Canada traditionally, and I expect it will do the same, will go down the middle of a sensible approach. But at the end of the day, the technology isn't the issue. It certainly needs time, but the issue are all of these broader contexts around this. Next, please. So in terms of security, privacy, I think I mentioned before that we hear that that's already happening. It swung from the Wild West days of social media. It swung, you know, I think to a reasonable place that it is today, but it might be swinging back to the other side.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Matt. This is Roland from OCC. We're getting a little bit of muffled sound on your mic. I'm not sure if something was covering it for a second there.
Oh, sorry. Is that better now?
Oh, there you go. It's perfect again.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
If you wouldn't mind starting over at security and privacy.
So basically, the issue is not with the rules. I think the rules are great. The issue is with individuals. There's a lot of judgment on this. I can give you lots of examples. We know, for example, a researcher that has been involved in doing and taking aggregate genetic data, no identifying information, just aggregate data about genetics, so that they could run models and do research in terms of the population as a whole without getting one individual named. It's just aggregate percentages and so on. They have to do, you know, fraud scans, banking scan, you know, fingerprinting. Her and her husband have to do that. I think that that's a case where people are making contextual decisions that are wrong. We've had situations where we've had a user, a licensed user, a training provider or an employer in one jurisdiction actually go in and try to, hack to see if they can, crash the system sort of out of their ego or whatever drove them. But they didn't do it in the right way. And they told the client, the government, that they did this. They managed to get some data that they're entitled to. They didn't get any records data. They just got, tombstone data, email. I think year of birth was the most sensitive, but email, name. And, we had people in that government that wanted to submit this to a few hundred people and tell them that their data has been compromised. And so it cost $50,000 worth of lawyers and lots of good thinking and the security people weighing in to convince that one individual that that's actually worse. And that doesn't follow a significant risk of harm, which is one of the characteristics. So the issue is not the regulations in general or the guidelines. The issue is the people who feel it's better to CYA in some cases and scare people, who haven't been compromised, than basically, do a more sensible approach. That's always my issue with privacy and security. And by the way, in terms of Ontario, love the province, and I don't know if anybody from the province is on the phone. We've had such a great working relationship with them, and I think they've got it right. Next, please. So the sort of my takeaways on security and privacy, it's the opposite of everything you learned in kindergarten. That's so don't ask. We don't ask for information that we don't need. That's one of our rules. Don't show. We redact data that people don't need to see. They might need to see something about you, but they don't need to see all of it. Don't assume. We don't assume that people consent to anything. You have to ask them very explicitly and make sure they consent. Don't share. So basically share only the data that's required for people, for other stakeholders to do their job, because we have a multi-stakeholder platform. We have to share some data, but that's with consent, and that's only what people need. Don't trust. Even people worry about hackers on the outside. We've seen over the last 10 or 12 years attempts from friendlies, authorized users trying to be hot dogs, trying to break the system, just doing bad things for the fun of it, trying to do it. I'm very happy to say we've never had a breach. We've never been hacked, but that doesn't mean it hasn't been attempted several times. So you have to have that mindset. You're going to be attacked, and don't deflect. One of the funny things I find about this when we're doing sort of presentations and there's multiple vendors going in, a lot of people will use Amazon's security policies and say and point to them about safety. If you're involved in making those decisions, say, yeah, that's nice. That's what Amazon has. What do you have? Do you have SOC 2? Do you have CSA Star? Do you have this standard? How do you secure your people, your data, your equipment? And obviously, being a NATO secret company, we have to put a lot of attention on it. But a lot of people respond to RFPs and projects with Amazon or Google Cloud security protocols, not their own. Next. So I won't get into more of this, but I think we've already covered it, that I think that Canada will walk the middle ground. I think in terms of the COVID passport technology, we believe it's going to be worker driven, and the workers will defend that. There has to be a quick test to make sure, the crazy boss, ex-girlfriend, ex-boyfriend, ex-aunt, whatever it may be, is not going in there as you and getting access to your records. So there is artificial intelligence and facial recognition, a whole bunch of stuff I won't get into, to make sure you are who you are requesting your defense certificate. That's the kind of technology that has to be put in place, and has to be equal access, because I don't think the right to work should be a lottery that you're lucky or unlucky enough to have the antibodies because you survived COVID-19. That is a tenuous sort of debate, but you can actually give certificates based on things that we can all do. Like we can all get a vaccine. We can all get the PCR test when it's widely available, if it's demanded for a certain industry. So we think it should be as much equal access, not the lottery of who's had it, who hasn't. We don't want to keep any clinical data. I think that's critical. You just want to issue passports or certificates fed by that, but you don't want to hold on to anybody's data. And obviously, we think as in California, high priority sectors you're going to have to start, when you start seeing this technology rolled out for home care, long-term care, prisons, homeless shelters, 50% of the deaths in Ontario come from long-term care. That's got to be the area where people have the passport, and home care workers and so on, that they can prove that they've been tested recently. So we are only focusing on workplace because that's our company. We're a workplace company, but there will be some debate. And again, we don't have any opinion, but I think I'm just giving that as a heads up. Society will debate if this goes on for too long. Do you need this passport to be recently tested or have been vaccinated when the vaccine's available to get into a ball game, to get into a tennis match, or so on? Next, please. So I think that's it. I won't get into much more here, but I think that the battle to safeguard tomorrow has to start now. I think we're all overwhelmed right now. You know, I know a lot of people working in the space of public health are, you know, close to burnout situation, but they're doing good work. We are going to have, and Rocco's going to join us on Thursday at 10 a.m. That's the link. So you're welcome to join us if you want to hear more about this technology and how to use it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Imad. Just real practical advice and considerations around the immunity passports and kind of what our future is going to be looking like very soon. Our final speaker is Isaac Straley, who's the Chief Information Security Officer at the University of Toronto. He joined the U of T in December 2018 and is a known thought leader in information security and privacy. There's Isaac. He's known for his collaborative approach, and previously to the U of T, he'd held progressively senior roles at the University of California, Irvine. Isaac, looking forward to your thoughts.
Great, thank you. My talk will be a little bit different than the previous two in terms of digging into security a little bit. There's a lot of topics that we could talk about when we talk about security, especially when we're talking about the time we're in right now, and especially as we start to look towards reopening the economy in the ways we've been talking about. And so I'd like to give you some practical advice, and you'll see why, but I also tune this to be a little bit more personal. So I'll be talking to you directly, but this is things I hope you can take away, learn from, or ask more questions about. My opening slide here, you can see the one team, one goal moniker I've got up here, and that's sort of what I want to open with, which is we are all in this together. This is something that we're talking about security and privacy. We're going to have, as we've already discussed today, a variety of views, concerns, angles, economic drivers, all of these things. But I do want to say that we have to work on these solutions together, and if we don't, we're going to end up in a worse situation or a loggerheads that don't get us anywhere, especially when we talk about things like the economic impact. So you're probably familiar with the University of Toronto, but it's important to sort of recognize for the purposes of today's talk where we're coming from. University of Toronto has over 90,000 students, over 25,000 faculty and staff. We have a large diversity of partners and visitors and collaborators sort of across the country and across the world. It's a big place, and I'm not saying this to talk University of Toronto up, but as we look at the partners that we work with and the data that we have and the areas that we're concerned about, we've got anywhere from teaching instruction to partnerships to actual medical clinics and labs, legal clinics and labs. The point being that not only can you view a university like the University of Toronto as a large city, but it's connected in many ways to our economy. And if you can think, I like to say, if you can think of a business practice or something that might happen in an education institution, we've got it. And whether you're talking about research in a particular area, data collection about individuals, actual work that people are doing, the support that we provide to the community through public service, and this is true of most universities. Universities are major economic drivers, and we certainly consider ourselves part of the solution here. But as we look towards the mobility of the workforce, especially making changes that weren't planned, there are a number of things to think about. I've put together a list here that are things that I think you should all be thinking about. Certainly they're things that we're thinking about. They may or may not be relevant to us, and they may or may not be relevant to you, but these are sort of high-level areas that are areas of concern. I'm not going to read through all of these, but to highlight a few of them, when we look at the remote access that likely people need as they've moved out into their homes and other areas, especially if you weren't planning to do it, this likely opens up more direct access to data and more direct access to data from unmanaged devices or personal networks. And what I'm going to do through the rest of the talk is not talk through these. My understanding is the Chamber of Commerce has put together several good talks, and there's a lot of good information about the risks that we face. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit more to the personal angle on this. And as you look at those slides I just went through in terms of the complexity of a place like the University of Toronto, again, the point is not to say how big we are. The point is to say that we can't solve a problem in one way. And certainly before the situation, security is something that there is an individual component to. You can't rely just on the technology, and as other speakers have intimated, it sometimes creates a situation where it's very adversarial in terms of demanding security and privacy, which I think there's an appropriate component to that, but there's also some things that we all need to do. And one of the biggest struggles we've always had is how do we communicate that in a meaningful and achievable way? I'm going to try to do some of that today and show you some areas where you can get some more resources. And the remote access is a big piece of this. So as people are working from home on their home networks or on devices that maybe they didn't work from before, that definitely increases the amount of risk to data. And that's really coupled with the second one, which is much of security design, especially when we're talking about physical security design, where people are working in offices, are built on the idea that they're in place. And a lot of movement has gone to remote work, but not everybody is in the same place with that. And so if you've built up protections on your physical network, assuming people will be in that place, now a lot of those protections are gone. And certainly that's relevant, and I've got some numbers to share with you, because we think that we know that sophisticated actors are targeting, they're specifically targeting COVID-19 researchers, but also the impacts of that are being seen wide and broad. And there's sort of two vectors. There's more than this, but things that we're concerned about are criminal organizations. This is a common situation we've already faced with security. These are organizations that are looking to make money and make big money. And usually they use things like ransomware attacks. So ransomware is malicious software that gets on whatever device you have, locks you out of your data, and then asks you to pay to get back access to it. And the thinking right now is, especially in this remote work time, and especially when there's so much critical research going on, that if the attackers can get that data locked down, the people will definitely pay for it. And the other is nation state actors. So this is nation states are other countries putting high-level resources behind attacks, trying to either disrupt or do espionage, which obviously is a thing the university is concerned about, and many people who are especially creating intellectual property are concerned about. And we're seeing a large number in phishing attacks. And the last thing on this one that I want you to think about is what you might be here branded as the digital divide. For us, this is a big concern with students and others, but across the board, you have individuals who have a variety of access to technology, access to networking and network speeds, and actual IT support you may or may not be able to provide depending on the organization, the size, and those things. And people are even more than usual being asked to step up and be their own IT support for many of these things. And this is relevant even when we talk about like contact tracing apps and passport apps and things like that, because there's a one angle, which is make sure the system is secure, make sure the application is secure, but somebody's still using and managing that device, and there's always going to be a personal component to that. But let's get off of sort of this piece. I really like data, so just some metrics, and there's a variety of sources for this. I happen to pick a publicly available one from a company called BitSight. They're a partner of ours, so I feel comfortable doing that. But there's lots of information. They took a snapshot for the last week of March, and from what they were able to determine, 45% of remote office networks, and this is, you can read this more like home networks, observed malware. Those networks were 3 times as likely to have, especially the home networks, to have at least one malware infection. The those networks were less protected, so they had more things visible to the internet that could be attacked. And we're seeing a substantive increase in the amount of phishing attacks. This is from a different metric, but 40% uptick in phishing since the beginning of the year, 72% increase in specifically attacks trying to target penetration of networks. And I'm seeing things like the government reported that since the beginning of the year, 120,000 new fake domains went up, specifically themed around COVID-19. So just some data here to say this is a real problem. As a security expert, I don't want to just talk about things that are scary. We want to be more forward focused, but it's important to understand the situation we're in. So the world dramatically changed starting in March with this, not only because people were working remotely, but the attackers have taken advantage of this as an opportunity. So as we look into the advice that we've got here, the first one is, and I've already said it, we're sort of in the shared fate. So the model that I put together for our community and something that I'm sharing with you here today is one that I hope will resonate more. Again, the practical advice is one that we know is challenging to get into individual hands, especially when we don't expect and not everybody can be a security expert. We don't expect that to happen. So it's a 5-pronged approach, especially in these times. Protect your network, protect yourself, protect your passwords, your devices, your data. And I've got some practical tips on each of these. I put a couple of references down. One, you can see the guidance that we've given. We've branded this as Remote Security Matters. Security Matters is our typical branding, but we've added a flair to it. And the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity just put out a really good piece of information. I've linked that at the bottom here. I think that came out just yesterday, in fact. It's really, really good advice to take a look at. So when we look at protecting your network, this is one of the things that in the more traditional environment, the network itself would be doing a lot of the protections for us. And each of these slides, and I'm not going to read through each of these, I've left this in a way where you can take these at your leisure to work through them, but certainly at your home network, you're no longer protected by organizational defenses, especially if you can't directly access your remote network. But even then, you may have other devices on your network, like if you've got somebody who's going to school and they've got a personal laptop, or other people who are coming in with potentially compromised devices. That's all now something to be concerned about. And so it is really important to make sure that the Wi-Fi is configured well. I put one technical indicator in here. I don't expect everybody to understand how to securely configure a Wi-Fi, but I find that in terms of communicating this message out, if you're going to have to do it yourself, at least seeing some keywords. If you see some variation of what I put up here, it's probably better than nothing. It certainly is better than nothing. The other thing I really want to call out, again, trying to aim for practical advice, is not just things like where appropriate, use the VPN. And again, I'm talking to individuals here. So as an organization, you might want to consider if you've provided remote access that is good enough to help manage some of these issues. But also to the individual, I really think that there's a service you should be taking a look at that CIRA just put out. CIRA is the registration agency that sort of oversees the .ca domain. They put out a really phenomenal service called CIRA Canadian Shield. It's a free service that you can configure at the network level or the device level that will, you can decide which level you want to do it at, but if you put it at the protected level is what it's called, it will actually start to block out some of that phishing and malware, and you could achieve some of the defenses you might have on the organizational or on the business network. And it's free, it's hosted in Canada, and it's privacy conscious, and they've got material on that on their website. I think this is a phenomenal service being provided, and it's certainly something that we're recommending. If nobody can do anything else, I would definitely turn this on. Obviously, there's the protect yourself angle. I won't spend a lot of time on this today, but this is recognizing that the phishing and spam and ransomware attacks are all increasing, and they're the tried and true techniques. They send messages that, especially now, they look like they're from a friend, they look like they're from a coworker, they can be relatively well targeted, especially as machine learning becomes more prominent here, and they tell you to do something quick, or they give you an offer that's too good to be true. And most attacks that are successful still come in this route. Certainly passwords are a big part of this. So one of the next things that they do once they've attacked you through phishing is try to steal your password because you've got legitimate access or somebody has a legitimate access. Some of the old advice is still relevant. You want to have a good password, although we always change up the advice. Now we're talking about passphrases. But I think more importantly is not just the advice on password, but is one, use a password manager where appropriate. I've listed one here. This is not a hard recommendation, but one to start that's a free one that I think is relatively easy to use. And also be looking for multi-factor authentication. So as an individual, turn this on wherever you can on your personal areas and your personal systems, your personal applications. And I provide a link of an easy way to figure out if your service that you're using that you're concerned about has it. And as an organization, if you aren't looking at multi-factor authentication, turning it on for the services that you use, this is something that, again, number one piece of advice is to get MFA, multi-factor authentication, turned on. And multi-factor authentication is just something that adds a second step. Usually it's a push to your device, or it might be a code that you have to type in. You see this with banking and other things. And what it does is nullify the value of the password. So if somebody has stolen your username and password, this makes it so it's no longer good to them. So it decreases the value. And at the end of the day, a lot of security is an economic proposition. We just want to do more than the attackers can do or make it hard enough that's not worth their time. Especially if you're using personal managed devices. And I suspect there's people who have started doing this. We have to keep those devices up to date. And again, these aren't being managed by an IT department, or they're not being managed through antivirus and other things. And so it's important to keep those devices up to date and to try to use some sort of antivirus software if it's appropriate. And a piece of advice you may not be thinking about is the things that are being used for work, limit their access for non-work activities, especially if you've got individuals who are going to classes and visiting websites or playing video games or anything like that. It's really important to separate the devices, easy as it might be in some cases to use the same one. And then lastly, and probably the most important but the hardest one to talk around in terms of practical advice in a forum like this, which is protect your data. Use your organization's file storage and try to avoid using cloud services that haven't been vetted. The Chamber of Commerce has actually put together quite a good list. Take a look at that, but remember that the default settings are not always good enough for these things. And I can't stress ransomware is real, backup. If you have to have a scope of protecting data, whether it's your organizational data or your personal data, make sure you're backing it up.
Isaac, that's really practical advice for businesses. If I could ask all the panelists to turn their cameras back on. Just going to go and ask one question to sum up. In terms of a lot of the members of the Chamber of Commerce are from small, medium-sized businesses, and the OCC put out a release yesterday just in terms of the province's roadmap to reopen the province. And we identified in there that it presents a challenge for a lot of small, medium-sized businesses, particularly ones in remote area who don't have the capital, the resources to combat and to draw upon to address some of the issues. So if I was just to go around the horn once, and if you could provide one piece of advice for a smaller organization, knowing what's going to be happening with the contact tracing and immunity passports and network security around the area of privacy and security, what one piece of advice would you give to a small or medium-sized business in Ontario? Maybe Emad, we'll start with you.
I would, well, first of all, I would say, resistance is futile to some extent in terms of you're going to need to, in order to survive, and I hate to use that word, a lot of businesses are going to need to show that they're safe for the workers, and that they're going to need to show that obviously they're safe for their customers. And the confidence aspect of this is probably the most important survival strategy I can think of for any business going forward. And not just survival, it's not all doom and gloom. I think some companies will grow, and the ones that survive, a lot of them will thrive going forward. So I think what's very important in general is just to be upfront and transparent about what you're doing, why you're doing it, Follow best practices. I mean, don't be out on a limb and sort of doing things that are not commonplace. You're going to be in good company with a lot of these technologies. You're going to see them. A lot of them will be voluntary. Some of them won't be, depending on your sector. But I think it's just important to be very transparent and to realize that this is an opportunity to help your workers to feel more safe and help your customers more safe. And frankly, if you're not able to do that, your business is at risk.
That's a very pointed, focused advice. Thank you, Matt. Christine, just a few thoughts. A thought for you in terms of, one piece of advice for smaller business in Ontario.
I think I might have the flip side to Imad's comment, and that is to organizations and individuals: don't be freaked out by the technology and the all the the paranoia around privacy. I think people often forget that technology is there as an alternative to something that we currently have. In the contact tracing area, we have we have healthcare workers collecting this data, and no one is asking what they are doing with it. So before you decide that you're not going to do this because there may be privacy issues, think about the bigger picture and think about what the relative incremental risk is, rather than just being freaked out by the fact that it's something new.
Great. So we'll focus on transparency and thinking strategically. Isaac, you have the last word.
Great, thank you. I think I'll work with that risk word. I think it's the technology landscape in terms of the workforce is going to be different for each organization, and I think it's making it. My message is take a look at the real risk in terms of are you providing solutions for, especially if you maintain a mobile workforce, do they have the right tools to access your data safely and protect it, or is the reality that they're going to be doing some things on their own, and are they aware and trained properly to do that, to take on that responsibility? And I think that there is going to be an amount of responsibility, and so we're going to have to continue to get the word out to individuals to both, much to Christine's point, although in a different way, don't be afraid of the technology, but also recognize for the business landscape what risk you have there and how do you manage it.
Great. So transparency, strategy, and recognizing the risk. Great advice. Thank you, all the panelists. And I'd like to, for some final comments, call on Rocco Rossi from President and CEO of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. Rocco?
Thanks, Brent. And I know that all of the attendees today want me to thank all of our panelists for sharing their wisdom and their time with us. As we learned in last week's session, in real life, it's not about real-time data, it's about right-time data. And right now is the time that we need the right data in the right spots, in the right hands. And that is going to be even more pronounced as we move through this crisis. I want to thank again our sponsors, Canada Life and the Chambers Plan. I want to thank all of our participants. This webinar will be put up on our website, occ.ca/webinars. So you can see these beautiful, handsome people again and again and again. And please keep your suggestions for future webinars coming in. Keep safe, keep secure, keep healthy. We'll see you at the next webinar. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you, Rocco.